The morning of December 16th, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. The frozen ground crunched beneath Obergefreiter Klaus Brandt's boots as he crouched behind the stone wall of a farmhouse, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. The MG-42 machine gun sat before him, its barrel pointed toward the tree line where American positions had been identified through reconnaissance the previous night. Brandt had fired thousands of rounds through MG-42s during 3 years of service on the Eastern Front and in France. He understood the weapon intimately. The 7.92mm rounds, the 1100 rounds per minute cyclic rate, the distinctive sound that had earned it the nickname Hitler's Buzzsaw among Allied troops. His assistant gunner, Heinrich, fed the first belt into the receiver with practiced efficiency. Everything was ready for the attack that would come with dawn. What Brandt didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to adequately communicate despite 2 years of fighting American forces in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, was that the Americans had positioned their own machine guns across that field, not the light 30 caliber Browning M1919S that Germans had encountered and respected, but something far more devastating, the Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun. And in the next hour, Brandt would learn why American soldiers called it Ma Deuce, with a mixture of affection and reverence, while German soldiers who survived encounters with it used different words entirely. The sound, they would say later in prisoner interrogations and post-war accounts, was unlike anything in their combat experience. Not the sharp crack of rifles or the rhythmic chatter of machine guns they knew, but something that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. One German machine gunner, captured 3 days into the Battle of the Bulge, told his American interrogators that the 50 caliber sounded like God himself, ripping sheet metal apart in the sky. Another described it as the voice of industrial death. These weren't poetic exaggerations from men prone to dramatics. These were practical assessments from combat veterans trying to convey the psychological impact of facing a weapon that fundamentally changed the mathematics of infantry combat. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun, adopted by the United States military on June 15, 1933, represented more than just another crew-served weapon. It embodied American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Overwhelming firepower through massive ammunition, long-range engagement capability that extended the battlefield, mechanical reliability that kept guns firing in conditions that silenced lesser weapons, and standardized production that put the weapon in every infantry company, on every vehicle, aboard every vessel and aircraft that needed defensive armament. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By December 1944, when Brandt's unit launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest as part of Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp, the United States Army had fielded hundreds of thousands of M2 machine guns across all theaters. The weapon had proven itself in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and across the Pacific Islands. German forces had encountered it repeatedly, learned to respect its capabilities, and developed tactics to counter it. But respect and tactical knowledge couldn't change the fundamental reality that the M2 delivered firepower at ranges and with penetrating power that German infantry weapons simply couldn't match. The genesis of the 50 caliber machine gun traced back to World War I, when American forces encountered German aircraft and light armored vehicles that existing 30 caliber weapons couldn't effectively engage. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces in France, sent urgent cables to Washington in 1918 requesting development of a heavy machine gun capable of defeating armor plate and engaging aircraft at extended ranges. The request reached Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis, who passed it to John Moses Browning, already legendary for designing the M1917 30 caliber machine gun and numerous other firearms. Browning approached the problem with characteristic methodical brilliance. Simply scaling up the 30 caliber machine gun wouldn't work due to the dramatically increased forces involved in firing larger ammunition. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge, standing for Browning machine gun, generated chamber pressures and recoil forces several times greater than the .30 caliber round. Every component needed redesign to handle these forces while maintaining reliability. The bolt had to lock more securely. The barrel required heavier construction to contain higher pressures. The recoil system needed to absorb much greater energy without damaging the weapon or mount. Browning completed the initial design in 1918, but the war ended before production could begin. Development continued through the 1920s as the military refined requirements and Browning improved the design. The M1921 model underwent extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, revealing weaknesses that Browning systematically addressed. Feeding problems with the large cartridges required redesign of the feed mechanism. Overheating during sustained fire demanded improvements to the barrel quick-change system. The headspace adjustment, critical for reliable function with the powerful cartridge, needed simplification for field conditions. By 1933, the weapon had evolved into the M2, a mature design that balanced power, reliability, and manufacturability. The United States military adopted it, officially, and production began at several facilities. Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut, built thousands. The Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors in Michigan produced tens of thousands. Buffalo Arms Corporation, Frigidaire, and numerous other contractors contributed to total production that would exceed 2 million units by war's end. The M2's technical specifications told a story of engineering ambition realized through practical design. The weapon fired the .50 caliber BMG cartridge, a massive round measuring 12.7 mm in diameter and 99 mm in overall length. The standard ball ammunition propelled a 709-grain projectile, nearly 1.5 ounces of hardened steel and lead, at velocities approaching 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy delivered at the muzzle exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds, more than 10 times the energy of standard rifle cartridges. This enormous energy translated to devastating terminal effects. The .50 caliber round could penetrate nearly 1 inch of homogeneous armor plate at 500 yards, defeat concrete walls up to 8 inches thick, destroy engine blocks, shred structural components, and defeat virtually any cover that infantrymen might use for protection. Sandbags that stopped rifle rounds offered no protection against .50 caliber fire. Stone walls that provided excellent cover against small arms crumbled under sustained .50 caliber fire. Even light armored vehicles found their protection inadequate against the massive projectiles. The weapon's effective range extended beyond 2,000 yards, more than a mile, against point targets, and even farther against area targets like massed infantry or vehicles. This range capability meant that M2 gunners could engage German forces long before enemy machine guns could return effective fire. The psychological impact of receiving accurate fire from positions too distant to effectively suppress created tactical problems that German infantry commanders struggled to solve throughout the war. The M2's cyclic rate of fire ran between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on configuration and ammunition type. This was slower than German machine guns like the MG42, which fired 1,100 rounds per minute, or the MG34, which managed 850 rounds per minute. But the comparison was misleading because the .50 caliber round delivered so much more energy per projectile. Each .50 caliber bullet carried the kinetic energy of roughly 10 7.92 mm German rifle rounds. Therefore, while the German MG42 might fire twice as many rounds per minute, the M2 delivered comparable or greater total energy on target. More critically, the M2's lower cyclic rate actually improved practical effectiveness in sustained fire rolls. The slower rate meant ammunition lasted longer. Between belt changes, reduced barrel heating that would eventually require barrel changes, allowed gunners more time to observe and adjust fire, and created psychological effects through the weapon's distinctive, methodical sound that seemed more controlled and therefore more terrifying than the frantic buzz of faster-firing weapons. German soldiers who survived engagements with M2S consistently mentioned the sound in their accounts. The weapon produced a distinctive, deep, rhythmic pounding, sometimes described as boom boom boom, rather than the ripping cloth sound of the MG-42. Each round fired created a pressure wave that could be felt as much as heard at close range. The muzzle blast, enormous due to the powder charge, created visible shock waves in dusty or humid conditions, and the supersonic crack of the heavy projectiles passing overhead carried for extraordinary distances, creating psychological effects on enemy troops who might be under fire without even seeing the weapon, firing at them. The M2's construction reflected American manufacturing philosophy. The weapon broke down into major assemblies that could be replaced in field conditions without specialized tools. The barrel, one of the most critical components due to erosion from hot gases and friction from projectiles, could be changed in under a minute by trained crews, using only the headspace and timing gauges carried with each weapon. This quick change capability allowed sustained fire rates that would destroy weapons with fixed barrels. During combat operations, M2 crews developed techniques for maintaining continuous fire by having spare barrels ready and rotating them every 150 to 200 rounds. This prevented any single barrel from overheating to the point of losing accuracy or failing mechanically. With this technique, properly supplied M2 positions could maintain harassing fire indefinitely, something that profoundly affected German infantry tactics in defensive positions, where they found themselves unable to move in daylight due to continuous 50 caliber coverage of all approaches. The weapon's weight, approximately 84 pounds for the gun itself, plus another 44 pounds for the M3 tripod mount, required a crew of at least 3 men for tactical movement. One carried the gun, a second carried the tripod, and a third carried ammunition. Additional crew members typically carried more ammunition, spare barrels, and maintenance equipment. A full M2 squad might consist of 6 to 8 men when including ammunition bearers needed to sustain fire during extended engagements. This crew requirement was significantly larger than that needed for German machine guns. The MG-42, at 25 pounds, could be moved by a single soldier if necessary, though it normally operated with a 2-man crew, but the trade-off in firepower and capability more than justified the additional manpower. An M2 position could control a far larger area of battlefield than any German machine gun, engage targets at ranges where German weapons were ineffective, and defeat cover that German weapons couldn't penetrate. American tactical doctrine incorporated the M2 at multiple echelons. Infantry companies received M2S for use in the weapons platoon, typically 2 guns per company, providing heavy fire support for rifle platoons. These weapons defended key terrain, supported attacks by suppressing enemy positions, and provided anti-vehicle capability against light armor and trucks. Their primary role was direct fire support, engaging targets that company commanders designated as requiring the M2's unique combination of range, penetration, and sustained fire capability. Vehicle-mounted M2S appeared on virtually every American vehicle large enough to accommodate the weapon. Half-tracks carried 1 or more M2S for convoy defense and fire support. Tanks mounted an M2 for the tank commander's use, providing suppressive fire against infantry and soft targets. Tank destroyers used M2S as secondary armament. Jeeps sometimes mounted M2S for special purposes, though the weapon's weight and recoil made this challenging. Transport trucks frequently mounted M2S in improvised ring mounts for convoy protection. The ubiquity of the weapon meant German forces could expect to encounter M2 fire in virtually any engagement with American forces. This created tactical complications because the weapon's long range and penetration meant that German infantry couldn't simply maneuver around strong points as they might against rifle-caliber weapons. The M2 controlled such large areas that bypassing often wasn't practical, forcing frontal approaches that exposed attacking forces to devastating fire. Aircraft armament represented another major use of the M2. Fighter aircraft typically carried 6 or 8 M2S, providing the primary armament for air combat and ground attack missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns with over 3,000 rounds total ammunition. The P-51 Mustang similarly mounted 6 M2S. The combined weight of fire from multiple aircraft strafing German positions created effects that survivors described as apocalyptic. The incoming fire was so heavy and so destructive that men caught in the open had virtually no chance of survival. Bomber defensive armament relied almost entirely on M2s, positioned throughout the aircraft to provide coverage against fighter attacks. The B-17 Flying Fortress eventually mounted 1350 caliber machine guns in various positions, creating the interlocking fields of fire that made American bomber formations so difficult to attack successfully. German fighter pilots who survived attacks on American bomber formations consistently reported the psychological impact of facing dozens or hundreds of 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously from the massed bombers. Naval applications saw M2s mounted on virtually every American vessel, from PT boats to battleships. Small craft used them as primary armament against similar enemy craft and for coastal patrol. Larger vessels mounted dozens of M2s in anti-aircraft positions, creating layered defenses against attacking aircraft. The naval versions incorporated water cooling jackets and enhanced corrosion resistance for maritime environments, but the basic weapon remained the same, proven M2 design. By 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge began, American forces had accumulated 3 years of combat experience with the M2 across multiple theaters. Crews had developed techniques for maximizing effectiveness under various conditions. Snow and extreme cold, common in northern Europe during winter, posed challenges for all weapons, but the M2 proved remarkably resistant to cold weather problems when properly maintained. Crews learned to keep weapons covered until needed, preventing snow accumulation in the action. They used special cold weather lubricants that didn't congeal at low temperatures. They stored ammunition where body heat would keep it from freezing, as frozen ammunition could cause feeding problems. Desert conditions in North Africa had taught different lessons. Sand and dust required meticulous cleaning to prevent abrasion damage to moving parts. Covers over the feed mechanism, when not actively firing, prevented contamination. Higher temperatures actually improved some aspects of performance by reducing the pressure required to cycle the action, though extreme heat could cause ammunition to cook off if left chambered in a hot weapon. Jungle environments in the Pacific created yet more challenges. High humidity caused corrosion that required constant maintenance. Heavy vegetation limited the long-range advantage that made the M2 so effective in open terrain. But even in close-range jungle fighting, the weapon's ability to destroy cover and vegetation proved valuable for clearing Japanese defensive positions that might otherwise require extended assaults. The combat record that American M2 crews compiled between 1942 and late 1944 established the weapon's reputation among both American and German forces. In North Africa, M2s mounted on vehicles and in defensive positions provided fire support that helped stop German armor attacks, despite American numerical and tactical disadvantages in early encounters. The weapon's ability to damage light armor and destroy vehicle components like engines, tracks, and wheels gave American infantry anti-vehicle capability beyond what their standard armament provided. Sicily and Italy saw extensive M2 use in mountain warfare, where the weapon's long range proved especially valuable. German positions on hillsides and ridgelines could be engaged from valleys at ranges where German return fire was ineffective. The psychological impact on German defenders of receiving accurate heavy machine gun fire from positions they couldn't effectively engage forced tactical changes that complicated German defensive planning. France, after D-Day, demonstrated the weapon's versatility in varied terrain from the close bocage country of Normandy to the more open terrain of central France. In the hedgerows, M2s provided the firepower needed to suppress German positions while infantry maneuvered. The weapon's ability to penetrate the thick hedgerows themselves, something rifle-caliber weapons struggled with, made it invaluable for breaking through the compartmented battlefield that favored defenders. German military intelligence collected extensive information on the M2 through captured weapons, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield observation. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht units, describing the weapon's capabilities and suggesting tactics for countering it. But understanding the threat didn't eliminate it or create effective counters given the weapon's range and firepower advantages. The fundamental problem German infantry faced when encountering M2 positions was the same challenge that any force faces when opposing weapons with superior range and penetration: Standard infantry tactics emphasized maneuver to flank positions, suppression to keep defenders unable to fire effectively, and concentration of force at decisive points. All of these tactics became more difficult or impossible against M2 positions that could engage attacking forces at ranges beyond effective German small arms fire. Attempting to suppress an M2 position with rifle fire, or even MG42 fire, was futile at the ranges where the M2 could engage effectively. German infantry would be taking casualties from 50 caliber fire, while their return fire had little chance of hitting the M2 crew or forcing them to take cover. The mathematical reality was stark. An M2 could engage point targets effectively at 1,500 yards or more. German infantry weapons were most effective at 300 to 500 yards. This meant there was a range band of roughly 1,000 yards where the M2 could fire with impunity, while German troops could not effectively return fire. Flanking maneuvers required movement, and movement under M2 fire was extraordinarily dangerous. The weapon's high rate of sustained fire and its ability to engage moving targets at long range meant that German soldiers attempting to maneuver often took casualties before reaching positions where they could effectively engage the American position. The psychological stress of attempting tactical movement while under heavy machine gun fire that could penetrate any available cover degraded unit cohesion and attack momentum. Concentration of force, the traditional solution to strongpoints, was difficult when the M2's range allowed early engagement of forming assault forces. German commanders needed to mass infantry for attacks on prepared positions, but forming up within M2 range meant taking casualties during the assembly phase before the attack even began. This forced German units to assemble outside M2 range, then advance across 1,000 yards or more under fire before reaching ranges where their own weapons became effective. Such advances against prepared positions with competent defenders rarely succeeded without prohibitive casualties. The preferred German solution to M2 positions was indirect fire from mortars or artillery, destroying the position without requiring infantry to close with it under fire. But American tactical doctrine anticipated this response and incorporated countermeasures. M2 positions were typically dug in with overhead cover against air-burst artillery, positioned where terrain features provided some protection, supported by infantry who could call for defensive artillery fire if German forces massed for an assault, and prepared with pre-planned withdrawal routes if the position became untenable. Additionally, American artillery superiority, both in quantity of tubes and ammunition availability, meant that German artillery attempting to suppress M2 positions often found themselves targeted by American counter-battery fire that was faster, more accurate, and more sustained than what German guns could deliver. The mathematics of artillery exchanges favored the side with more guns and more ammunition, which was consistently the American side after mid-1943. Klaus Brandt understood none of these larger strategic and tactical realities as he huddled behind his MG42 position in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th. His knowledge came from immediate experience and the briefings his unit had received about the upcoming offensive. They would achieve surprise, the officers had promised. The Americans would be caught unprepared. German armor would break through weak American defensive positions and drive for the Meuse River bridges. Infantry would follow, mopping up resistance and securing the flanks. The plan seemed sound enough to Brandt, who had survived 3 years of combat by not questioning orders and focusing on his specific responsibilities. His job was simple. When the attack began, he would provide suppressive fire on identified American positions while assault groups advanced. The MG42 could fire 1,100 rounds per minute, and he had 2,500 rounds of belted ammunition ready. That should be more than enough to keep American heads down while German infantry closed the distance. What Brandt couldn't know despite German intelligence efforts, was that the American positions facing his section included not just riflemen and light machine guns, but at least 3 M2 heavy machine guns positioned in mutually supporting positions with clear fields of fire across the approaches German forces would use. The American 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had only recently arrived in theatre, nevertheless had trained extensively with their weapons and prepared their positions with the methodical attention to detail that characterized American defensive preparations. The American M2 crews had spent weeks improving their positions, digging deep fighting positions with overhead cover, clearing fields of fire that extended over 1,000 yards, pre-registering range markers so they could estimate distances accurately, stockpiling ammunition and spare barrels, and rehearsing crew drills until barrel changes took less than a minute and malfunction clearances were automatic responses, requiring no conscious thought. As dawn approached and German artillery began the preparatory bombardment that would signal the offensive's start, these American crews settled into their positions with the mixture of fear and determination common to all soldiers facing combat. They had heard the M2 called many things during training: Mardeus, for the M2 designation; the 50, in casual reference to its caliber; heavy machine gun, in formal tactical contexts. But they would soon hear what German soldiers called it, in German, terms that meant roughly American murder machine, or the long-range killer, or simply the 50, pronounced in German, but instantly recognizable as referring to the weapon they had learned to: fear. The artillery preparation lasted 30 minutes, German guns dropping high explosive shells on suspected American positions in an attempt to destroy defenses and demoralize defenders before the infantry assault began. Some shells landed near American positions, but the overhead cover and deep fighting positions protected most crews from anything except direct hits. The M2s, mounted on their heavy tripods and secured in position, survived the barrage intact and ready for action. When the artillery lifted and German infantry began their advance through the dawn mist and smoke, the American forward observers initially held their fire, waiting for the attacking forces to close into effective range of all weapons. This was standard defensive doctrine, allowing attackers to penetrate the defensive zone before opening fire, preventing them from taking cover outside the defense's most effective range and forcing them to attack across a beaten zone under heavy fire. Brandt's section advanced in proper tactical formation, assault groups moving by bounds while the MG-42 teams provided covering fire. The technique was sound and had worked successfully in Poland, France, and Russia. Move, fire, move again, constantly pressuring defenders while providing mutual support between maneuver and support elements. Brandt fired short bursts from his MG-42, not really aiming at specific targets because he couldn't see any in the smoke and morning mist, but placing fire where American positions had been identified through observation. Then the American positions opened fire, and Brandt's understanding of the battlefield changed completely and permanently in the span of 3 seconds. The sound came first, before conscious recognition of what it meant: a deep, rhythmic booming unlike any weapon Brandt had encountered. Not the sharp crack of rifles or the tearing cloth sound of MG-42s he knew intimately. Something heavier, more deliberate, like massive hammers striking steel plates in rapid succession. Boom, 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 boom. The sound seemed to vibrate in his chest despite the distance. Then the impacts began arriving, and the attack dissolved into chaos. The 50 caliber rounds struck with effects that seemed impossible from small arms fire. Stone walls that had provided cover against rifle fire exploded into fragments as the massive projectiles punched through. The farmhouse wall that Brandt crouched behind, solid stone construction over a foot thick, began disintegrating under sustained fire. Chunks of masonry, the size of a man's fist, flew in all directions as each round impacted. The stone that had stood for perhaps a century crumbled in seconds under the hammering. Heinrich, the assistant gunner, screamed something that Brandt couldn't hear over the roar of incoming fire. Then, Heinrich simply ceased to exist as a functioning human being. A 50 caliber round struck him in the torso, and the hydrostatic shock combined with the massive wound channel created by the tumbling projectile destroyed so much tissue that death was instantaneous. Brandt, sprayed with blood and fragments, couldn't process what he had just witnessed. Men died in combat. He had seen it hundreds of times, but not like this. Not disintegrated by a single round from a weapon firing from a position so distant he couldn't even see the muzzle flashes clearly through the smoke and mist. The MG-42 sat useless before him. Returning fire was impossible because he couldn't identify targets at the range where the American weapons were firing from. Even if he could see them, His weapon's effective range was perhaps 800 yards against point targets, and these guns were firing from positions that appeared to be at least twice that distance, based on the time between the sound of firing and the arrival of impacts. The mathematics of ballistics that Brandt understood intuitively through experience told him he was taking fire from positions beyond his ability to suppress or neutralize with available weapons. All across the German assault line, the same realization was occurring simultaneously. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts found themselves facing something fundamentally different from previous experience. The weight of fire, the range at which it was delivered, the effects on impact, all combined to create a tactical situation that German infantry doctrine had no effective answer for. Advance, and you died. Stay in place, and you died. Retreat, and you died, shot in the back while running. The beaten zone extended so far and the fire was so sustained that no option seemed to offer survival. Brandt pressed himself into the smallest possible space behind what remained of the stone wall, knowing intellectually that the wall provided no real protection against weapons that could punch through it like paper, but unable to force himself to move anywhere else. The psychological paralysis that heavy fire creates in even experienced soldiers had taken hold. His training and experience told him to maneuver, to find better cover, to do something other than simply wait for the round that would kill him. But his body refused to respond to these commands, frozen by the overwhelming sensory input of sustained heavy machine gun fire. The attack had failed within 5 minutes of American positions opening fire. German infantry that had begun the assault with confidence born of surprise and numerical advantage in this sector now huddled in whatever cover they could find, pinned down by fire they couldn't effectively return. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the gunfire. Radio communications reported the situation to higher headquarters, requesting artillery support, armor support, air support, anything that might suppress or destroy the American positions that were systematically shredding the assault. But the American M2 crews continued firing, rotating barrels every few hundred rounds as they had been trained, drawing on ammunition stockpiles that seemed endless to the German soldiers receiving the fire. Each gun had thousands of rounds immediately available, and more could be brought forward from company supply points. The crews had trained for exactly this scenario, defending against massed infantry assault, and their preparation showed in the disciplined, methodical way they serviced targets across the entire defensive front. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The sustained nature of American fire also created psychological pressure. German MG-42 crews, constrained by ammunition, supply and barrel life considerations, typically fired in short bursts. Even during defensive actions where sustained fire was necessary, gunners fired bursts of perhaps 10 to 15 rounds, paused briefly to observe and adjust, then fired again. This created a rhythm to machine gun fire that opposing soldiers could anticipate and work with. Moving during the pauses, the M2 crews, blessed with abundant ammunition and multiple spare barrels, could maintain fire for minutes at a time without significant pauses. The continuous incoming fire meant no opportunity for movement, no chance to advance or withdraw safely, just continuous pressure that wore down even the strongest soldiers' psychological reserves. Men who had endured Soviet artillery barrages lasting hours found themselves breaking under sustained 50-caliber fire that lasted mere minutes. The personal, directed nature of machine gun fire created different psychological effects than impersonal artillery. Casualties mounted steadily throughout the morning as German forces attempted repeatedly to advance against prepared American positions. Each assault wave encountered the same devastating fire, the same inability to suppress or maneuver against American positions, the same brutal casualties that destroyed unit cohesion. By noon, when German commanders finally acknowledged that frontal assault against these positions was futile without armor or artillery support that wasn't immediately available, casualties in some assault companies exceeded 50%. Half the men who had attacked at dawn were dead, wounded, or missing. Brandt survived, though he would never be entirely certain how. The stone wall that he sheltered behind, despite being progressively destroyed by sustained fire, apparently provided just enough protection to prevent any rounds from striking him directly. Other soldiers in his section were less fortunate. Of the 8 men who had advanced with him that morning, 4 were dead, and 2 were too badly wounded to continue fighting. The MG-42 that had been his responsibility sat abandoned in the rubble, undamaged but useless, without a crew to man it and without any tactical purpose, given the futility of returning fire against weapons that could engage from beyond German effective range. The American M2 crews who had inflicted this devastation had suffered minimal casualties. German artillery, when it finally arrived hours after being requested, proved largely ineffective against well-prepared positions with overhead cover. A few near misses from large-caliber shells wounded crew members and damaged one weapon's mount, but the positions remained operational throughout the day. The crews rotated personnel to prevent fatigue, bringing fresh gunners forward from company reserves, while exhausted crews rested briefly before returning to their weapons. The ammunition expenditure was enormous by German standards, but entirely normal by American logistics practices. A single M2 firing continuously for 1 hour at moderate cyclic rate would expend approximately 30,000 rounds. With 3 guns engaging throughout the morning, total expenditure approached 90,000 rounds, roughly 4,500 pounds of ammunition. This seemed impossible to German observers who calculated ammunition requirements based on their own constrained logistics, but American supply doctrine assumed high consumption rates and provided accordingly. The ammunition arrived at company level in ammunition trucks that drove forward from battalion supply points. Working parties carried it forward to gun positions in metal ammunition cans, each can holding 100 rounds in belted form. The physical labor of moving tons of ammunition forward was considerable, but American units had the manpower and organization to sustain it. Soldiers who weren't actively fighting served as ammunition bearers, creating human supply chains that kept weapons fed regardless of consumption rates. This logistical capability, as much as the weapons themselves, created American tactical advantages that German forces struggled to counter. German ammunition supply operated on much more constrained assumptions about expenditure rates. Machine gun ammunition was carefully rationed, with specific allocations per weapon per day that limited sustained fire capabilities. When German units exceeded their allocation, resupply could take days or weeks depending on overall supply priorities and transport availability. American units could expend ammunition freely, knowing that resupply would arrive continuously from a logistics system that prioritized keeping forward units supplied. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks beyond that first terrible day, but the pattern established in early engagements persisted throughout. German forces achieved initial surprise and territorial gains in sectors where American defenses were thin or unprepared. But wherever American units established coherent defensive lines with properly positioned weapons and adequate ammunition, German advances stalled. The M2 heavy machine gun played a significant role in this defensive success, providing the long-range, high-volume firepower that allowed relatively small American forces to hold against larger German attacks. The weapon's impact extended beyond its direct combat effects to broader tactical and operational implications. German commanders planning attacks had to account for American M2 positions, allocating additional forces and time to deal with them, or bypassing them if possible, and accepting the risk to flanks and rear areas. This complicated German planning and slowed operational tempo, giving American forces time to reinforce threatened sectors and prepare counterattacks. At tactical level, German infantry learned through painful experience to identify M2 positions quickly and avoid exposing themselves unnecessarily. The weapon's distinctive sound, once experienced, was never forgotten. Survivors passed their knowledge to new replacements, teaching them to recognize the audio signature and respond appropriately by seeking substantial cover or withdrawing if no adequate cover was available. This was practical wisdom purchased with blood, and it probably saved lives. But it also meant German infantry operated under psychological burden, knowing that any advance might encounter weapons that could engage them at ranges where they couldn't fight back effectively. The quick-change barrel system was perhaps the most critical feature enabling sustained fire. Barrels heated rapidly during sustained fire, and excessive heat caused several problems. Accuracy degraded as the hot barrel warped slightly, changing point of impact. Reliability suffered as heat affected cartridge pressures and extraction forces. Eventually, extreme heat could cause ammunition to cook off, firing without the trigger being pulled as the heat in the chamber ignited propellant, and prolonged exposure to extreme heat could permanently damage barrels through metallurgical changes that weakened the steel. The M2's barrel could be changed quickly by a trained crew, removing the hot barrel and replacing it with a cool spare in under a minute. This allowed continuous fire by rotating through multiple barrels, keeping any single barrel from reaching temperatures that would cause problems. Crews typically changed barrels every 100 to 200 rounds during sustained fire, though the weapon could fire more rounds before absolutely requiring a barrel change. The conservative approach to barrel changes helped maintain accuracy and reliability while extending barrel life. German machine guns lacked this quick change capability, in practical terms. The MG42 technically had a quick change barrel system, but the barrel was changed from the side of the weapon and required the weapon to be dismounted from its tripod or bipod. This made barrel changes during active engagement difficult or impossible in many situations. The result was that German crews pushed their barrels harder, accepting degraded accuracy and increased risk of malfunction, rather than ceasing fire to change barrels. The M2's more user-friendly barrel change system provided practical advantages that showed in sustained fire situations. The ammunition itself deserves examination for understanding the M2's combat effectiveness. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge came in numerous variations designed for specific purposes. Ball ammunition, the standard general-purpose round, used a hardened steel core surrounded by a gilding metal jacket. This projectile would penetrate mild steel armor plate up to 1 inch thick at moderate ranges, defeat concrete and masonry, and punch through most field fortifications. The wound ballistics were devastating against personnel, with the heavy bullet creating massive permanent wound channels and hydrostatic shock effects that caused injuries far beyond the projectile's actual path. Armor-piercing ammunition used a tungsten carbide core that could defeat heavier armor than ball ammunition. These rounds could penetrate over 1 inch of hardened armor plate at 500 yards, making them effective against light armored vehicles and fortifications. The tungsten core, being much harder than steel, maintained integrity during penetration and created catastrophic damage to whatever lay beyond the armor. German light armor that provided adequate protection against rifle-caliber armor-piercing rounds offered no real protection against 50 caliber armor-piercing fire. Mixed belts, combining ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in predetermined ratios, gave gunners versatility for engaging various target types without changing ammunition. A typical mix might be 4 ball, 1 armor-piercing, 1 incendiary, and 1 tracer in a repeating pattern. This ensured that regardless of target type, some rounds in each burst would be appropriate for engaging it effectively. The incendiary rounds would affect flammable targets, the armor-piercing rounds would defeat light armor, and the ball rounds provided general effectiveness against personnel and materiel. The manufacturing of 50 caliber ammunition occurred at industrial scales that would have seemed impossible to pre-war military planners. American ammunition plants produced billions of rounds of small arms ammunition during the war years, with 50 caliber production reaching hundreds of millions of rounds annually by 1944. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, dedicated in September 1941, eventually employed over 20,000 workers, producing small arms ammunition in quantities that dwarfed German production. Twin Cities Arsenal in Minnesota, Frankfurt Arsenal in Pennsylvania, and numerous other facilities contributed to total production that exceeded German output by factors of 5 to 10 in most categories. This ammunition flowed to American forces through logistics networks of unprecedented scale and efficiency. Cargo ships carried millions of rounds across the Atlantic to British ports. Trains moved it to forward supply depots. Trucks brought it to division and regimental supply points. Working parties carried it forward to companies and platoons. The entire system was designed around the assumption that ammunition would be expended freely and needed to be continuously replaced. American military doctrine didn't ask soldiers to conserve ammunition and make every shot count. It provided ammunition in such abundance that soldiers could fire whenever they had targets, knowing that resupply was routine and reliable. German logistics operated under completely different constraints. Ammunition was always in shorter supply relative to demand. Units received allocations that limited daily expenditure. Resupply was irregular and often delayed by Allied bombing of rail networks and fuel shortages that limited truck transport. German soldiers were trained to conserve ammunition, fire in short bursts, make careful aimed shots, and only engage targets worth the expenditure. This conservation mindset, while tactically sound given German logistics limitations, meant that German units typically could not match American volume of fire in sustained engagements. The contrast was stark and strategically significant. An American infantry company might expend more ammunition in a day of heavy combat than a German company would receive in a week. This disparity didn't reflect poor German logistics planning or incompetent German supply officers. It reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity, resource access, and transportation infrastructure between the combatants. Germany simply couldn't produce and transport ammunition at scales that matched American output, even when German industry operated at maximum wartime production levels. The operational implications of this ammunition disparity showed clearly in defensive actions where American forces could establish prepared positions with adequate supply. German attacks against such positions faced devastating fire volumes that German forces couldn't match or suppress through counterfire. The mathematics were brutally simple. If an American M2 crew could fire 300 rounds per minute in sustained fire, and a German infantry company attacking that position could only fire perhaps 2,000 rounds total from all their weapons before exhausting basic load, the American position would still be firing long after German attackers had expended available ammunition. This meant German attacks had to succeed quickly through maneuver and shock action before ammunition ran low, or they would inevitably fail as combat devolved into attritional exchanges of fire that favored the side with more ammunition. American defenders could afford to maintain fire indefinitely, knowing resupply would arrive. German attackers had to conserve ammunition for fear of running dry in the middle of an engagement. The psychological effects of these different situations affected combat effectiveness in ways difficult to quantify, but nonetheless significant. Klaus Brandt, captured 3 days after his unit's failed attack, provided American intelligence officers with detailed information during routine interrogation. He was not a Nazi fanatic committed to dying for the Reich. He was a professional soldier who had done his duty as he understood it and was now a prisoner trying to survive captivity. His interrogators, fluent German speakers trained in extracting tactical intelligence without coercion, asked about his experiences with various American weapons. When they reached the .50 caliber machine gun, Brandt's responses became detailed and emotional in a way that surprised the interrogators. He described the sound in terms that the interpreter struggled to translate, precisely because the German phrase Brandt used, "Wie Gott selbst Blech zerreißt," literally meant like God himself tearing sheet metal, but conveyed emotional content beyond the literal words. The interrogators noted in their report that the subject became agitated when discussing the .50 caliber, showing signs of psychological trauma associated with the weapon. This was unusual enough in a veteran of 3 years combat that the interrogators flagged it for analysis. Similar responses appeared in other prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the Battle of the Bulge and subsequent fighting. German soldiers consistently described the M2 in terms suggesting psychological impact beyond its direct combat effects. Some called it Die Mördermaschine, the murder machine. Others used Der Langstreckentöter, roughly the long-range killer. A few simply called it Die 50, the 50, pronouncing the English word with German phonetics in recognition that no German weapon compared to it. These terms weren't official military designations appearing in German, tactical manuals. They were soldiers' slang, the informal language that frontline troops developed to communicate shared experiences. The existence of specific slang terms for the M2 indicated how significantly the weapon had impressed itself on German soldiers' consciousness. They didn't develop similar terms for most American weapons, because most American weapons didn't create experiences sufficiently unique or traumatic to require special vocabulary. The technical and tactical advantages the M2 provided were real and measurable, but the psychological effects may have been equally important to American defensive success. German infantry attacking prepared American positions did so with degraded effectiveness because they knew those positions likely contained M2s that would engage them at ranges where they couldn't fight back. This knowledge created hesitation, reduced aggressive combat behavior, and made men seek cover more readily. The cumulative effect of these small changes in individual behavior was reduced combat effectiveness at unit level. American units, conversely, defended with confidence born of knowing their heavy weapons, could engage German forces at extended ranges. This confidence showed in tactical decision-making, with American commanders more willing to hold positions against numerically superior attacks. The psychological advantage of superior firepower multiplied the actual combat effects, creating tactical outcomes that favored American forces beyond what simple comparison of weapons specifications would predict. The sound that so affected German soldiers was a product of the weapon's mechanical operation and the cartridge's ballistics. The M2's recoil operation meant each shot created a distinct mechanical sound as the bolt cycled, combining with the muzzle blast to produce the characteristic deep boom. The large powder charge in the .50 caliber cartridge created a muzzle blast significantly louder than rifle caliber weapons, and the supersonic projectile created a crack that could be heard at considerable distances. All these sounds combined to create the distinctive audio signature that German soldiers learned to recognize and fear. The muzzle blast alone could cause physical discomfort at close range. Soldiers positioned near a firing M2 experienced pressure waves with each shot that could be felt in the chest and inner ear. Prolonged exposure to M2 fire without hearing protection caused temporary or permanent hearing damage to crew members, a problem that was understood but accepted as inevitable cost of operating heavy weapons. The crews adapted by positioning themselves to minimize exposure where possible and accepting damage as part of their duty. The physical effects of .50 caliber fire on human bodies were catastrophic in ways that seemed disproportionate to the projectile's size. A round striking the torso would typically create an entry wound roughly half an inch in diameter, pass through the body, destroying everything in its path through both direct crushing and hydrostatic shock effects, and exit, leaving a wound several inches across. The hydrostatic shock, created by the rapid displacement of tissue and fluids as the projectile passed through, could cause injuries far from the wound channel itself. Blood vessels ruptured, organs failed, bones shattered from shock waves alone. Hits to limbs frequently resulted in traumatic amputations, with the limb essentially destroyed by the energy transfer. Even near misses could cause injuries through secondary effects. Rounds striking hard surfaces like stone or metal would fragment, creating shotgun-like patterns of shrapnel that wounded anyone nearby. The same rounds would create flying debris from whatever they struck, with fragments of stone, wood, or metal becoming secondary projectiles capable of causing injuries. Medical personnel treating casualties from .50 caliber fire quickly learned that these wounds required different approaches than typical combat injuries. The massive tissue destruction often meant that limb wounds required amputation because too much tissue was destroyed to save the limb. Torso wounds were frequently fatal regardless of treatment because the wound channels destroyed so many vital structures simultaneously that no surgery could address all the damage quickly enough. The soldiers who survived .50 caliber hits were those who took extremity wounds or grazing hits that didn't pass through their bodies. The effect of .50 caliber fire on equipment and materiel was similarly devastating. Light vehicles offered no protection whatsoever. Rounds passed through truck bodies as if they were paper, destroying engines, transmissions, and any equipment or supplies the trucks carried. Armored vehicles with light armor found their protection inadequate. Half-tracks, armored cars, and similar vehicles could be penetrated by .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds at combat ranges. Even heavier, armored vehicles could suffer damage to external components like tracks, vision ports, and weapons. Aircraft were particularly vulnerable to .50 caliber fire due to their necessarily light construction. A single .50 caliber hit could destroy an aircraft by damaging critical components like engines, fuel systems, or control surfaces. The presence of hundreds of M2s in any given sector of the Western Front meant that German aircraft operating at low altitude faced tremendous danger from ground fire. Luftwaffe pilots learned to avoid areas where American ground forces were concentrated unless absolutely necessary for their mission, because the risk of being shot down by ground fire was simply too high. Fortifications that might protect against rifle fire offered little protection against sustained .50 caliber fire. Sandbags, the standard field fortification material, would stop .50 caliber rounds, but only with sufficient depth. A sandbag wall needed to be 4 to 6 feet thick to reliably stop .50 caliber armor-piercing ammunition. This was impractical for most field fortifications due to the labor and materials required. As a result, German defensive positions that would adequately protect against rifle and machine gun fire were vulnerable to .50 caliber fire that could penetrate the protection and kill or wound the soldiers behind it. Log bunkers and timber-covered positions fared better, as heavy timber could absorb .50 caliber fire reasonably well. But even here, sustained fire would eventually chew through the protection. A position that might withstand thousands of rifle caliber rounds might fail after hundreds of .50 caliber impacts as the cumulative damage weakened structural members. German engineers learned to build positions with .50 caliber fire in mind, using much heavier construction than had been necessary on the Eastern Front, where Soviet heavy machine guns were less common. Stone and concrete provided the best protection against .50 caliber fire, but even these had limits. Unreinforced masonry would eventually crumble under sustained fire as individual rounds shattered the stone or concrete, creating progressive damage that eventually compromised the structure. Reinforced concrete could withstand .50 caliber fire indefinitely, but required resources and time to construct that were often unavailable in fluid combat situations. The practical result was that German defensive positions rarely had protection adequate against sustained .50 caliber fire from all directions. The ammunition expenditure that American M2 crews routinely achieved seemed impossible to German observers familiar with their own ammunition constraints. A single M2 firing for an hour at moderate sustained fire rates would expend more ammunition than a German infantry company's entire machine gun allocation for a day. When multiplied across dozens or hundreds of M2s in a division sector, total expenditure reached levels that German logistics simply couldn't match. American ammunition ships crossing the Atlantic carried more small arms ammunition than German factories produced in months. This disparity ensured American forces would never run short while German forces operated under constant scarcity. The strategic implications were profound and contributed materially to German defeat. An army that cannot match enemy firepower faces losing battles through simple attrition. An army that cannot sustain fire in defensive actions will be overrun by determined attacks. An army that must conserve ammunition while its enemy expends freely operates under psychological burden that affects combat effectiveness. Germany faced all these problems simultaneously in the war's final year, and the M2 heavy machine gun represented one visible manifestation of the broader disparity. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.